Good evening, everybody. I'm an unexpected guest, and I've come to hear what my friends have to say. I'm Jane Harmon. I'm the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. I'm also a recovering politician, as they are, most of them, and a recovering lawyer, as some of them are. And back in the day, 100 years ago, I actually practiced international law. So I'm very interested in this annual event here and delighted that Homer Moyer, whom I haven't seen in a few years, and who back in the day was general counsel of the Department of Commerce when I was deputy secretary of the cabinet in the Carter White House, is here. And let me just say a couple of words about my other buds on the panel. Norm Ornstein is the one and only Norm Ornstein, and if you really want to understand Congress, I'm not sure about the rule of law, but Congress, talk to him. He had the smarts not to serve there with the rest of us. Ray LaHood is wonderful, and when he came to Congress in 1994, I had been there for 2 years, and he had an office in the attic next to mine, and we had a great time together. And David Skaggs, again, he looks very, very distinguished with his white face. I guess, I hope that's not the wrong word to say, but the face with the elegant white beard, I guess white face is okay. But in Congress and at the Aspen Institute and in other incarnations, he has been another thoughtful, it seems to me, person about Congress. And this topic, the responsibilities of Congress in maintaining the rule of law, it could not be more timely, gotta say. There's so much to discuss. So I'm staying for a while to listen to people who are smart and thoughtful, and I remind everybody that the business of the Wilson Center is to be smart and thoughtful and nonpartisan. It is a safe space, and we are very proud of the fact that, I'll just say it again, that we are ranked by our peers as number one in the world for the second year in a row in regional expertise, and number one in the world in international collaboration, and number 5 in the U.S., and yada, yada, yada. But the point is that what we care about here is being factual, being thoughtful, and being civil. So please welcome Homer Moyer and friends.
Jane, thank you so much for a warm and gracious welcome to all of us, and welcome to all of you. Welcome to this series, Preserving a Free Society, which is a series of bipartisan discussions of the rule of law and its importance in maintaining free societies. My name is Homer Moyer. It's my privilege to moderate this series of programs. And on behalf of the International Bar Association and the Woodrow Wilson Center, to welcome you all to this program, which, as Jane mentioned, is on responsibilities of the Congress in maintaining the rule of law. You have met our distinguished guests. I think there's information about each of them in your programs, but thanks to all of you for being here. Norm Ornstein and Ray LaHood and David Skaggs. Norm is an author who has written extensively about our government, about the rule of law, and about Congress. Ray LaHood was a Republican congressman from Illinois and then later Secretary of Transportation. David Skaggs was a Democratic congressman from the state of Colorado. When David and Ray were both in Congress, they created something known as the Bipartisan House Retreat, which brought members of both parties and their families together to strengthen those relationships and to facilitate the work of the Congress. Thanks also to all of you for being here and spending time with us. Our discussion today is about our legislative branch, as you know. We open a new session with each party in control of one of the houses of Congress, and we will discuss today Congress's ability to strengthen and improve the rule of law, as well as things that Congress might do that could erode or diminish the rule of law. And we'll discuss a number of topics. We'll talk about how current polarization might have an impact on the ability of Congress to perform its basic lawmaking functions, to provide oversight of the other branches of government, to implement its constitutional mandates of adopting laws protecting fundamental rights and protecting freedom of the press, to operate in the public interest with integrity and free of corruption, and finally, to improve the level of public confidence and trust in the Congress. Together with a couple of questions from you at the end of the session, which you may write on cards, which will be collected on both aisles. That is our modest agenda for today, so we will jump right in. And let's start with the basics. And let me ask, if the proverbial Martian landed on Earth and looked at our Congress, she might say, you have two houses of Congress. They are elected differently. Each one has two political parties. And you have a third branch of government that can both propose laws and veto laws. How, she might ask, did we come up with that structure for our government? David Skaggs, you're a student of the Federalist Papers, so I want to ask you, what were our founding fathers considering when they created this architecture? What were they trying to protect and what were they trying to guard against?
Well, you do me too much credit with that intro, Homer, but I'll do my best. As I read history and the Federalist Papers, this was a tension that existed in the minds and politics of the founders between the realization that the country needed a strong central government, but also one that wasn't too strong and that couldn't rush lawmaking at all, but needed to do it with deliberation and care, and we hoped attention to detail and consequences. And so, the structure of the three branches, the bicameral legislature, all of the checks and balances and separation of powers was sort of the hedge, as I understand it, against runaway lawmaking or authoritarian function, all, of course, against the backdrop of the rebellion against the king and against the dysfunction of the Articles of Confederation, which really didn't give us enough of a government to make it a workable country.
And that compact is pretty ancient history to us at this point, and the evils, that was the word used in some of the Federalist Papers that were of concern, are remote for us, and a bit of history. We now find ourselves in a different situation, a different time, and I want to turn Ray LaHood to political polarization. Adopting laws is obviously the central function of our legislature, and we are now affected by strong political polarization. And so first, let me ask your sense of how that affects and has affected the lawmaking function of our Congress.
Well, let me say a word, first of all, about Jane Harmon and the extraordinary standard that she has set for the Woodrow Wilson Center and her entire team. This is a place where people can come and speak and think and do it in a way that distinguishes whatever debate is going on. And Jane, thank you for all your leadership here. You've really set a high bar, and all of us that have watched you raise the bar are very proud of you and proud to call you a friend. I think people, I still have a home in Peoria where my congressional district was. I was born and raised there, and we raised our 4 kids there, so I go back to Peoria a lot. And people in my hometown want to know, why doesn't Congress do anything? And the reason Congress is held in so low a regard is because they don't do anything. And what I say, and what I wrote about in a book about my career in Congress is, when Newt got elected in 94, I got elected in 94. Newt got elected Speaker. He had been in the House, but after working for Bob Michel for 12 years, I was elected to his seat. And what I believe, which I think is true, and the record bears it out, Newt became Speaker, Clinton was in the White House. The two things that they had, the one thing that the two of them had in common, they knew they had to solve problems. They knew their job in Washington was to get things done. And during Newt's speakership and President Clinton's presidency, we passed 3 balanced budgets, welfare reform, Medicare reform, two multi-year funded transportation bills. Why? Not because Newt and Clinton liked one another, because they didn't. Not because they were politically compatible, because they weren't. They knew they had a job, and my feeling is people run against the institution and they come here with the idea that they can vote no on everything and they don't really have to support anything. That's why we've not fixed our broken immigration system. That's why the roads are crumbling around the country, because we haven't had a transportation bill. That's why we have a $2 trillion debt right now, because people don't care about passing a balanced budget. And that's true from the leadership all the way down to the members. It simply is. You have to elect people that when they run for the job, they know what the job is and they do the job. And that doesn't exist today.
Norm Ornstein, in your book with Thomas Mann, entitled It's Even Worse Than It Looks, the two of you stated that political polarization has become the norm. And you stated, and I quote, that it is the central and most problematic feature of contemporary American politics. And I might add that a recent Forbes magazine article characterized it as a growing cancer on the Congress. Ray just mentioned some of the consequences of this. What do you see as the most debilitating consequences of this?
Thanks, Homer. First, let me associate myself with the remarks of my distinguished friend and colleague about Jane and say I came here almost 50 years ago and immersed myself in Congress. I love Congress. And a good part of the reason I love Congress was people like David, Ray, and Jane who were there, they knew, to do the right thing for their constituents and for the nation. And just as Ray said, that meant you had to make some compromises. I was thinking of you today, Jane, as I watched the Intelligence Committee, which is a very different committee than it was when you were first there, when you took the reins. But as you know, it began to change even before you left. But now it's almost a farce. So with that preliminary, I want to address a couple of the things that my colleagues said. When the framers put this system together, there were opponents. We call them the AntiFederalists. They called themselves AntiFederalists. The Federalists won. The AntiFederalists are winning now. And the Republican Party is the party of AntiFederalists. They're people who want to blow up government, don't want a significant role for government to play, don't believe that these institutions should work the way they're working. And if we ever end up with a constitutional convention, and we're not far away, we may see that battle emerge in a different way, and it may have different outcomes. Now, with that, I would also say that, as David suggested, the framers, and especially Hamilton, were very concerned about making sure, and it wasn't just Hamilton, they had seen what autocratic government could do. They wanted to build safeguards. And those safeguards included an electoral college at the time that had distinguished men from around the country, only men, who would sift through and make sure that if some demagogue or somebody without any values or who was there to enrich himself at the expense of the country somehow emerged as a leading candidate, that they wouldn't let that happen. That's long gone. But the other pillar was an independent Congress that would put some boundaries around what a lawless, immoral, or amoral president, and of course for Hamilton it really was Aaron Burr as his model, but he wasn't just thinking of Burr. that Congress was going to be the body that would provide those boundaries. And as we look further and as we get deeper into our conversation, if Congress doesn't provide those boundaries with its eye first on the larger set of goals and on the rule of law, then things can happen that are too familiar to us now. Now, back to your question, one of the things that Tom and I suggested in that book, and its sequel, It's Even Worse Than It Was, soon to become Run for Your Lives, was that our framers set up a system that was not going to be a parliamentary system. And they chose the word Congress for the legislature, not Parliament. Parliament comes from the French word parler, to speak. And you've all seen Question Period. A parliamentary system, you have one government in charge, and it's the government that sets policy, and the parliament with a majority ratifies it, and the role of the minority is to oppose it all and then to speak about it. Congress, which comes from the Latin word meaning coming together, was we're going to have people meet face to face, and they could come from Peoria, and they could come from Los Angeles, not Los Angeles then, but whatever the equivalent was, or the equivalent of Colorado, and by meeting together and debating and deliberating face to face, they'd see how other people came to their viewpoint, what kinds of people they represented, and organically come to some broad leadership consensus. What we have seen in the last 20 years plus is parties behaving like parliamentary parties. And you cannot fit that square peg into the round hole that is our political system. Because especially if you have divided government, it doesn't work. If a minority party unites in opposition to everything. But even if you have one party in charge of everything, the framers and the norms that have developed around our political system set up, and partly because the framers didn't want tyranny of the majority any more than they wanted tyranny by a tyrant. We have supermajorities in different places through norms and through constitutional procedures. And so a minority can block things from happening or can behave in a pernicious fashion. And we've had that. Now, the one amendment I would give to that comment from the book is, and it really was, I think, a central point, it's not simply polarization. You can govern with polarization. Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch proved that you can solve problems when you have people from very different ideological perspectives if their goal is to solve problems. It is tribalism. And that's the best word to use because, you know, when Ray and some of his colleagues would get together with Democrats, the attitude was, these are honorable people who just view the world and have a different view of how policy ought to be done, but we all know there are problems and let's figure out a way in which we can work them out. Tribalism is, you're the enemy, you're trying to destroy our way of life. And when you have a political system with the modern means of communication, with tribal media and social media to amplify that, you get into a position that is an extraordinarily dangerous one. And that's where we are. And it also means that the values that are central to the system, including adherence to the rule of law, go right out the window if your goal is to make sure that evil people don't emerge. And so terms like own the libs really fits with that. If we can do something, even if it's bad, and that's going to make them feel discomfort, that's good. And if we do something that's good for the country, but they'll get some credit for it, that's terrible because they're evil people. And we're in I think a very bad place as a consequence. Sorry for the long answer.
Before we go on, I think that I should say that David Skaggs and I also love Jane Harman and think she's just terrific.
I agree.
This gridlock, this tribalism, obviously reflects an inability or an unwillingness to compromise. You've both given examples of how people have been able to work across the aisle with different ideologies. Ray LaHood, why is it that now people are either unwilling or able to do that and to sit down and hammer out compromises on difficult national issues?
Well, with the I think the advent of President Obama's election and the first 2 years when the Democrats were in control, they pretty much worked their will in terms of passing a significant stimulus bill, passing comprehensive health care, and a few other things that, a few rules and regulations that people didn't like. And that brought the advent of the Tea Party. And in my opinion, when the Tea Party was elected in 2010, you had people elected with the idea of pretty much what Norm said. They don't believe in government. They don't believe in solving problems. They came to Washington to vote no on everything. If it was Obama's idea, it was a bad idea. And fortunately, many of them have been swept out of office. And the Democratic majority in the House, to me, owes their election to President Trump because he spurred on voters all over the country to elect people who were going to come here and solve problems. And the Democrats have a big opportunity here to do an awful lot, at least in the House of Representatives, and show the people that they can get a few things done. I think many of the people that were elected in the November election want to do what's right for the country. That's what you need in these offices. You need people who want to work on issues, debate issues, and the other big thing about this is the idea of compromise was sort of swept in 2010 that it was a bad idea. Don't ever compromise. And you saw that played out. And the one thing that I think everybody in this room knows is that in the 240-year history of our country, all the big issues that have been solved by compromise. People that are willing to talk to one another, listen to one another, give on this point or that point. And any big issue that's ever been solved, it's been done through compromise. And I believe that if we get back to that idea, then we make progress. But it's difficult to do. I think there is an opportunity in the House to do that, and we'll see how it plays out.
David?
Yeah, just to really underscore Ray's good point, but to sort of look at the underlying cause of the reluctance of the members that we put in Congress to compromise, I think stems in large part from the fact that the electorate no longer really holds compromise as a valid value of our politics. Why is that? In part, I think, because for a couple of generations now, the country and our states have neglected the fundamental role of our public education system, which is to school our people in our own system of government so they can cast informed votes and understand that built into that crazy architecture that the Martian wouldn't understand is the necessity for compromise. I mean, it is not an option, it's a requirement, and yet we have continued to elect people that kind of disavow the importance of working out differences. We were in the business of making deals, and that was honorable and still should be.
And of course, it's a great irony, given the fact that our Constitution itself is a product of compromises, multiple compromises. And we could spend a long time on what some of the underlying causes of this might be. Is there ideological arrogance, namely the view that your view is not only a right view, but the only right view, and therefore compromise is not appropriate? Is it something as simple as poor listening skills? You would think that by definition, someone in Congress representing constituents, broad number of constituents, would be a great listener. But there's evidence to the contrary that's pretty abundant. Let me ask a slightly different question, and it is about the potential spillover effects from what we see in Congress on other branches of government. Republican Senator Ben Sasse has made a very interesting observation that what many view as judicial activism, namely courts getting into the business of solving issues that really should be legislated on, it is the failure of the Congress that has generated what many see as judicial activism. Does that ring true to any of you?
Go ahead, Norm.
Certainly. You know, a long time ago, I wrote a piece called Passing the Buck and Pointing the Finger, which was that when Congress found it more and more difficult to work out legislation and turned, whenever they did, to omnibus bills where they could throw everything together with something that was going to make it to the finish line, it also meant compromising in ways that you didn't solve a lot of problems. You left them up to the courts. That included an awful lot of the detail from the Clean Air Act, for example. And then the courts would make decisions, and then members of Congress could go back home and say, look what those damn judges did. So there is something to that. But I think what's flowed from it is an understanding that if you can't prevail at the ballot box, and if those evil people are going to prevail, what you can do is get 37-year-olds to go on appeals courts who will be there for 50 years, long after voters have said, we don't like your policies anymore, and exercise the enormous power that judges have to make those policies still work, even if voters don't want them. And that has also meant a growing desire to make sure those judges will toe the ideological lines that you want, and there are now litmus tests. You almost never will see somebody nominated for the Supreme Court who was not an appeals court judge. And you rarely see anybody nominated for an appeals court who was not a district court judge. Why? Because you can look at their records and determine that they're going to do what you want them to do. And when you have this nonsense of every senator on the Judiciary Committee or others saying we don't ask them what their policy views are, as if they don't know what those policy views are, it becomes farcical. But what we also see, and here I take serious issue with Ben Sasse and many of his colleagues who talk a good game, we had 40 judges who went through the Senate Judiciary Committee in less than one day. Now, some of them had had preliminary hearings, but they're cranking them out. They're changing the rules now so that there won't be post-cloture debate. Ben Sasse voted for a 37-year-old with no visible experience that would qualify for an appeals court position without a second's thought. So the Senate is not doing what it's supposed to do, and this is corrupting the judiciary as well. It is the case. You know, when I talk to my friends who are on the Supreme Court, they all say, oh, this is so, it's exaggerated. 90 or 80% of the decisions that we make are 8-0 or 8-1 or 9-0. And I say, yeah, all the important decisions are 5-4. And those 5-4, you can predict 95% of the time who the 5 are and who the 4 are based on which presidents nominated them. And that's moved down to the appeals courts, and it's happening more and more, and it's moved to the district courts. And I'll say one more thing, that it's not just a sort of ideological tribalism. There's a ruthless pragmatism, I would say, to some of this that is embodied in Mitch McConnell. And that is, we're going to make sure, using every procedure we can use in the Senate, to block the other side from filling slots, even if they're slots that would be filled by very reasonable, highly qualified people. He did that to keep any of the positions on the D.C. Circuit, the most important appeals court we have, from being filled for 2 years plus in the Obama administration, and basically went to Harry Reid and said, I don't care who gets nominated. None of those slots will be filled because we're going to keep the conservative majority on that court. And then we saw what happened with Merrick Garland. And this gets to a larger point, Homer, which is the rule of law only works if the norms that undergird it are adhered to. Otherwise, there is no such thing as the rule of law. If judges are being picked not because they're going to be judicious, but because they have a certain viewpoint, if the way in which they get picked gets distorted because the norms are distorted, if the filibuster gets used in ways that it shouldn't, then there's no such thing as the rule of law. And even if the rules are there, even if the Constitution says something, it may not mean very much. And that's at the root, I think, of the deeper problem we have.
Can I just say one word? I think if Norm suggested a constitutional convention in his opening remarks, and I don't know if that'll ever happen. I think if it does happen, there will be a huge debate about setting an age limit on federal, district, and appellate court and Supreme Court justices. I think there'll be a big debate, and depending who the delegates are at a constitutional convention, you could see not a term limit, but more an age limit placed on these individuals in response to what Norm just talked about.
And Homer, I wanted to quibble a little bit with you about your framing of the question and the default of the legislature, the Congress, in doing its job, which I think has much more to do with its willingness to default to the administrative state, to agencies and rulemaking as a way of filling in the blanks that they couldn't figure out how to fill in on their own for whatever reason, and then that stuff then goes to the courts to see whether the rules comport with the statute, which comport with the Constitution. So it's a little bit more attenuated than just kicking the ball into the third branch. No disagreement with Norm's homily about the judiciary.
I will say, Ray, that I've been a long-time proponent of term limits for Supreme Court justices. And if I could have my druthers, I would have an 18-year limit staggered so that each president gets 2 justices. One single 18-year term. You can show your independence during that time, but it lowers the temperature, and it also means that the actuary doesn't determine which side picks more Supreme Court justices, and you won't have some of these other problems emerge. And I actually believe you can do it without a constitutional amendment. You just move those judges to appeals courts or to senior status after 18 years. So you're not violating the constitutional provision that judges serve in time of good behavior.
On the heels of Norm's comments about tribalism and the appointment of judges, it's almost quaint to recall that when Harry Truman became president after many years of FDR's presidency and numerous Democratic appointees to the Supreme Court, Harry Truman's appointment to the Supreme Court was a Republican. That seems almost unthinkable. Let's turn for a moment to separation of powers and checks and balances. That's obviously an important part of our governmental structure. And the question I want to ask, and Ray, maybe I'll turn first to you, is the checks and balances that Congress has are the purse strings, oversight, the ability to enact new laws or change laws. I want to ask how that fits with our two-party system and party loyalty. If you have the White House controlled by Party A, and you have many members of Party A in Congress, how does that sort out for members of Congress in terms of acting as a check and balance vis-a-vis the executive branch?
Well, when I was elected, Clinton was president, and we were in the majority for the first time in the House. For 40 years, we were in the minority and came into the majority. And most of the members of my class that were elected felt a strong allegiance to Speaker Gingrich because they felt that the contract with America brought them into power and brought them to the House of Representatives. So there was a strong allegiance. I'm proud to say that I was one of 3 Republicans that didn't sign the contract with America, and you know, I took my lumps for that, but you know, that's the way it works. And I think that then when President Bush was elected, there were many of us that felt, as Republicans, a very strong allegiance to President Bush. And many of us like the idea that before 9/11, people forget, before 9/11, President Bush got a very significant education reform passed called No Child Left Behind, whether you like it or not. And it was done with Senator Kennedy in the Senate and then Chairman John Boehner in the House, working together. And President Bush went to Massachusetts and signed the bill, and went to Boehner's district and signed the bill with them there. And so this gets back to my point again. You know, if you do have the kind of leadership with people who are in Washington to get things done, that are willing to compromise, a lot of things can get done. Bush was there. That was his major initiative that he ran on. He visited over 100 schools when he was campaigning. And he was able to persuade Senator Kennedy through compromise, and Boehner through compromise, to come up with a bill that really was initiative that he wanted to get passed. And people forget it because 9/11 happened shortly thereafter and nobody remembered that. But the point is, if you've got leadership in the White House who understand their job, get things done, be willing to compromise, and you have it in the Senate and the House, boom, a lot of things will get done. I think, obviously, Bush's administration changed dramatically after 9/11, but that's an example where if 9/11 hadn't happened, I think a lot of other compromise would have taken place, and I think we would have gotten immigration reform, which President Bush strongly supported.
Getting back to the checks and balances point, Homer, that you make, and the compromise lodestar that Ray properly identifies. If there's a single thing, in my opinion, that members of Congress ought to be mindful of, and in a role, if they have one, I hope they do, to reinforce and honor the rule of law, it is honoring the Article I branch as a principal, fundamental ingredient in our rule of law. It would be great, I think, if every new member of Congress had to take a half day and study Federalist 51 and understand what Madison and the guys had in mind in the checks and balances and ambition, keeping other ambition in check. But when I was a staffer, as was Ray, and back in the 70s when I was there, and the 80s when you were there was no question that members understood that their responsibility was to protect the prerogatives of the Article I branch. It didn't matter if your party had the presidency. That came first. And that, I think, is the central most important thing that the Congress can do to protect what we think of as the rule of law in this country, and not roll over just because the president happens to be a member of your tribe.
One of the features today is, if you look at public polls and public regard for our institutions, you will see that the level of public confidence and public trust in our major institutions, you can go to the Supreme Court, the presidency, religion and the church, big business, the press, the level of confidence in the Congress is between 1/3 and 1/2 of the levels of respect for each of the other major institutions of government. Now, is that because Congress is not getting things done? Is it because of the level of discourse in the Congress? Is it a function of the tribalism? But I want to move to what could be done to change that. That should be an alarming poll result for all of us.
So to put it into the broader context, though, it's hard to find any institution that is above water now. And one of the great challenges that we have is that there are no leaders who can emerge and bring people together across most of those boundaries anymore without getting caught in the crossfire. And what normally happens after you have a serious financial downturn or an economic hiccup is we get populism emerging, and people rebel against leadership, believe that they've been screwed by the elites in the society. And then when things start to get better, that goes down some. It's not going down, even as the economy has gotten better at all. And if you have the military basically as the only institution, religion no more. A couple of decades ago, I was on the board of National Commission on Public Service. We're almost at the 20th anniversary, chaired by Paul Volcker. And we had people like Ted Hesburgh, Father Hesburgh on that. And when Paul Volcker stood up, all 6'10" of him, everybody listened because he was a man and is a man of incredible character who did courageous things to solve problems. Ted Hesburgh was a giant moral figure. Find me one of those. A university president? A religious leader? No. A business leader? Please. Much less a figure in our politics. So Congress has always struggled with, except for very brief periods when the Great Society was done, people loved Congress. And it's built into the political system. It goes back to the framers. You don't trust people in positions of power. They all have feet of clay. We've gone through a lot of that. But it's a much deeper problem now, I think. And it's reinforced by all of, or so much in civil society as well. You can gain traction by denigrating others. And you have, and I think the biggest mistake, there were a few mistakes that President Obama made. To me, the biggest mistake coming in was he didn't take one of those financial figures and frog march him to trial. The sense that the miscreants who got us into this mess, that caused people to lose their homes or see everything they'd worked for decline in value or lose their jobs, while the others not only got away with it but then got bonuses, has made this populism so much tougher and was a part of the route that enabled a Donald Trump to emerge in the first place.
At least he put Ray at the Secretary of Transportation.
Obama did some wonderful things, but getting back to the point that Ray made, so you get George W. Bush elected, losing the popular vote, 36 days to get an outcome, losing seats in the House, in a terrible position, and George Miller and Ted Kennedy and the Democratic leaders said, we'll work with you. And getting No Child Left Behind gave him a boost that legitimized his presidency. Now, Obama gets elected by a sweeping margin with big majorities in both houses, and just one anecdote. We're flat on our backs economically. Dave Obey, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, calls in Jerry Lewis, good guy, we all like Jerry, his counterpart, the Republican minority leader on the committee, and says, Jerry, we got to do something. We need a stimulus package. And what I'd like you to do is go back to your leaders and your rank and file members and tell us the things that you would like to see in a stimulus package, and tell us the things that are absolute non-starters, and we'll work with you and we'll make this a big bipartisan package. And Jerry Lewis laughed and pointed up and said, Dave, I'm sorry, I've got orders from headquarters. We are not going to cooperate. That was a conscious decision made, and it was a decision made that if you oppose, like a parliamentary minority, everything this popular president wants, and even if he gets them through, then you delegitimize them, we can win in the midterms. And it worked like a charm, and that helped to take us down this rabbit hole that where we are now.
Ray and David, when you created the House Bipartisan Retreats to build relationships, bring people together, you perceived a need for that at the time. Do you see parallels now and then? What differences or parallels do you see?
Well, the parallels, I think, are, we've already pretty well covered them. They are just orders of magnitude worse than when Ray and I perceived this fraying of relationships across the aisle in the mid-90s that led us to get together and put the retreats together, which were, it was really basically human relations 101, derived from the realization that we've all talked about tonight, that if anything's going to get done, it means compromise and working out differences. that's hard to do if you don't know the other side at something other than an adversarial level. So, speaking for myself, Ray, I don't chime in if I get this wrong in your view, but what we wanted to do was establish relationships that got beyond the partisan, and really important part of that was having families there. So, really hard to demonize someone when their kid is playing with your kid. And that sort of thing happened much more back when families were in Washington. And there was that tempering of partisanship that I think can be attributed to the good influence of spouses and children. So, we were trying to build trust between the two parties, out of which occasionally anyway, agreements could emerge that people felt comfortable with because they were comfortable with each other.
These weekends took place 4 years in a row. First time a congressional spouse met another congressional spouse, for reasons that David said. Everybody lived in their districts. First time a congressional kid met another congressional kid. They didn't know if they were Republican or Democratic or, it didn't make any difference. If you know somebody, it's very hard to trash them. It's very hard to criticize them. If you get to know somebody's spouse, it's impossible. And if you get to know somebody's kids, it won't happen. And that's what we created. And it was a marvelous thing. And we had over 200 members, the first one, 150 spouses, 100 kids. And we went off to Hershey, Pennsylvania. We ate a lot of chocolate. And it worked. And it worked because people developed relationships with one another and then began working with one another. Another thing that I'm very proud of, Rahm Emanuel was a congressman from Chicago when I got elected, and I'm from Central Illinois. I'm Lebanese, he's Jewish, he's liberal, I'm probably more conservative. And he and I, after these retreats, every month he would get 7 Democrats and I'd get 7 Republicans. We'd go to the Monocle, no staff, have dinner together, and get to know one another. And we'd bring 7 different people every time. Those relationships helped develop the kind of esprit de corps that I think have lasted well beyond Congress, but made a difference. And that's what it takes. It takes people coming together, getting to know one another, and trying to figure out, how do you make something happen around here?
So can we dig out of this through initiatives like that or other steps, some courageous leadership?
And by the way, I will say this. Gebhardt was leader. Newt was speaker. They weren't too thrilled with these bipartisan retreats. To be honest, we had them kick and screaming to get them to come. But once they did, they realized the value of it. They really did. And it was valuable.
So these guys are heroes in my book for what they did, but I have to throw cold water on it for now. And I'll give you an example. In the Senate, you still do have a lot of senators whose families are here. And there are only 100 of them, and they actually do get to know each other pretty well. If you watched, just to pick one example, Lindsey Graham in the Judiciary Committee, screaming at the Democrats on that committee. These are all people he knows well, people he's gone to dinner with. He doesn't have a spouse or kids, but they're friends. It's a different world now. I'll give you an anecdote. One of my heroes, and he still is, one of the great people in public life, and anytime you call on him to do something for the public service, he's there, is Alan Simpson. And just one of the great human beings as well. So some years ago, Al came back to the Senate to visit. He was long out of the body. And as he walked into the Capitol, he bumped into Rick Santorum, then in the Senate, having come over from the House. And they walked under the chamber together, and Al immediately went over, saw Dale Bumpers, the Democrat from Arkansas, and he ambled over, and they embraced, and they were having a warm chat, and he looked back and saw an agitated Santorum near the door, kind of motioning him over. And after a few minutes, he went back and he said, "Yeah, what's up?" And Santorum said to him, "What was that all about?" And Simpson said, that's Dale Bumpers. He's like my blood brother. We came in together. We're very dear friends. We worked on all kinds of things together. And Santorum said to him, we don't do things like that around here anymore. And, I told that story for a while. I wasn't sure if it was apocryphal. And then I bumped into Simpson on the street one day, and I asked him, and he said, yeah, that's what happened. And I said to him, so was that because Santorum was upset that you were embracing a guy, or because you were embracing a Democrat? And I won't tell you what he said, but it was both. But it was mostly that he was embracing a Democrat. And this is a set of values that had begun to develop that had moved over. And so bipartisan retreats aren't going to do it anymore.
Right.
I'd still love to move families to Washington. I'd like to turn the old Congressional Hotel and the counterpart in the Senate into housing for members and families with a common dining area. And because you can't afford, most people who are not independently wealthy, to move your family here, at least to live anywhere near proximity to the Capitol. I'd like to change the schedule to have 3 weeks in Washington on and 1 week off, 5 days a week from 9 a.m. Monday to 5 p.m. Friday, and no fundraising during that 15 days, so you're not just running off the campus to raise money. The money thing is a huge part of this. But we have to be realistic. It's going to take something much more to change the norms that now, I mean, if you watch the Intelligence Committee and see what's happened there, all 9 Republicans on the committee signing a letter demanding that Adam Schiff resign. And if you watch one thing today, watch the C-SPAN clip of Schiff responding, and you can see these 9 members all knowing that what he's saying, or most of them, not Nunez, knowing that what he's saying is correct, but they're caught in a tribal world. And if they don't go along, they're shunned, and their lives could be ruined. And so it's going to take something more. And I would add as well, you know, the thrust of the country since the framing has been to give more role for the people in our governance, okay? We move from senators selected by state legislatures, which was another part of trying to make sure we didn't have authoritarians, to this move to have a popular election of the Senate. We move from having electors to actually having the voters make the choice, and the electors were just automatons, effectively. We moved to having women vote. Then we moved to before that, making sure that African Americans could vote, allowing women to vote, 18-year-olds to vote, all of that. Think now of what happens when you have most congressional districts set up in a way that even if there's an enormous popular desire to make something happen, they're immune from that kind of pressure. 80% of Americans who want, for example, immigration reform, and you don't see it happening. Think of a reality that by 2040, 50% of Americans will live in 8 states, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. Now, 50% in 8 states means that the Electoral College, more and more, we're going to see presidents who get elected without a majority of the popular vote, and the next time it could be losing it by 8 or 9 million. 70% of Americans in 15 states means that 30% of Americans will elect 70 senators, and they are not representative of the diversity of the country in the same way. So we've got a crisis of legitimacy emerging that is almost like the tsunami that follows the disastrous hurricane. The crisis in tribalism and the rule of law is now matching up with the fact that increasingly people are going to believe that their voices are not heard. What do we do about that?
Well, one of the things we can do, Colorado just passed and the governor signed membership in the Interstate Compact to not do away with the Electoral College, but make sure that it reflects the popular vote. Reluctantly, I think that's probably a good idea. I think the small states are adequately represented in the Senate, and we don't need to give them the extra boost that comes out of the Electoral College. But yeah, I worry about the legitimacy of our government in the hearts and minds of our people when this sort of thing continues to fester.
I'd like to touch briefly on 2 other big issues before, Michael, we take a couple of questions, which you guys have collected. on one norm you just raised, and it's campaign finance. And I'm not asking what the solution is, but surveys show that members of Congress spend half to two-thirds of their time fundraising as opposed to dealing with legislation and the like. Comment on that and the impact of that
Thank
on
you. Thank you. Yeah.
public interest.
I will now trot out my pet idea for how to break the logjam here, quixotic as it probably is. Even with Citizens United, the House and the Senate have plenary authority by their rulemaking under Article 1 to address this if they wished to, in particular to prohibit leadership PACs as a condition of membership in either body. Leadership PAC has now spread so that almost everybody has a leadership PAC, and they are pernicious, corrupting entities in which members are forced to raise money to pay party dues, to help their colleagues, and also, sadly, to use as a kind of slush fund for questionable purposes. But one would think that given what I sense among our now colleagues is their aversion to spending all of that time raising money, wouldn't they welcome a kind of mutual pact to do away with at least this part of the fundraising mania?
Last question. Earlier this week, there was an argument before the Supreme Court on gerrymandering. I don't want to ask you about that case or the legal issues or how that will come out, but I do want to ask about the impact that gerrymandering has on the day-to-day operations of the Congress. How does that manifest itself within those bodies?
So one of the things I'd like to ask Ray, because what I would love to do is to enact some version of what Illinois used to have in its state legislature, which is multi-member districts, which we could do by changing a 1967 law that required single-member districts. And in Illinois, it used to be that you'd have 3 votes, 3-member district. You could cast 3 for one person, 2 for one and 1 for another, or 1 for each of 3. And you got a wider range of candidates in more heterogeneous districts and an incentive to reach out to other groups of voters. So you had more moderate people. And I think it worked, and I'm sorry that you did away with it. So I'd like your views on that. But more generally, we have a larger problem, which is where people cluster, the big sort. You have people concentrated in cities and moving into other areas, and the districts increasingly are homogeneous. And if you did away with all gerrymandering and simply had compact districts that respected the boundaries of cities and counties and the like, you wouldn't necessarily have it better. It's much better when people represent diverse groups of people, even if the majority of the voters in the district have one particular coloration. I used to talk to Bob Livingston about this, who almost became speaker. And his district in Louisiana was a very Republican district, but he had about 19 or 20% African Americans. And it wasn't that he knew they would vote for him, but 1, he felt a fiduciary responsibility to represent them. 2, he didn't want to piss them off so much that they would turn out in droves against him. So he was sensitive about the language that he used and about the concerns that they had if they didn't violate his fundamental conservative beliefs. That district now has a trace element of African Americans, and you can see the way the racial divide plays out now even more in partisan terms, that it changes the way people think about things. And if you have a homogeneous district, and if it is mostly a safe district, and still 75 to 80% are safe by any standard, then we know what happens. You're in an echo chamber, and you are going to fear a primary much more than you will a general election. And, the fundamental reality is what we see now with Republicans in Congress who face regularly questions of whether they're going to follow their institutional loyalties or their party loyalties. If you have a president with 90% support from his own partisans, how are you going to go against that? And the wrong things happen. So this is a big deal. It requires more creative solutions, though, than just focusing on gerrymandering, but that's a key part of it. And I hope that the Supreme Court which now was faced with clear indications of extreme partisan gerrymandering, which even Brett Kavanaugh admitted was extreme, will bite the bullet and do something about it.
Michael, a couple of questions? Secretary LaHood, do you still consider yourself a Republican? If so, how can you and others help heal your party?
I voted in 1968 for Richard Nixon. I've been a Republican precinct committeeman. I served in the Illinois legislature for one term as a Republican, served in the U.S. House for 14 years as a Republican, and served in President Obama's administration for 4.5 years as a Republican. I tell people, I wouldn't have gotten the job if I hadn't been a Republican. Why wouldn't I be a Republican? The answer is I am a Republican. I'm a proud Republican. And I believe this, that if some of us don't stay in the party and pick up the pieces, then we're derelict in our responsibility. We need a good, strong Republican Party, and we don't have it right now. But this soon will pass. Trump will be gone, and there'll be pieces to pick up, and I want to be a part of the group of people that rebuilds the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, when I started out in politics, Chuck Percy, Illinois, one of the great senators of all time. Bob Michael, obviously, I'm very prejudiced about that. But we've had a group of distinguished Republicans who served in Congress, in the White House, in governor's offices, and eventually we'll get back to that. I don't know when, but we will, because that's what we do.
Next question. Everything is education. Life is now quick. No patience, no in-depth research and learning before being pushed quickly to restore or respond to populist concerns. How do you re-educate? Is it possible to do? And I take this to be a civic education issue in
Well, I think
large
what David
part.
said, and he hit on it. You know, I was a school teacher for 6 years, and I taught what we called back then civics. And if you had, in order to get out of the 8th grade, you had to pass the Constitution test. You had to know about the Constitution. You had to know how old you had to be in order to be president. You know, simple things like that and other complex things. I mean, David hit on it. You know,
I'm going to hit on it again.
Okay, go ahead. Go have at it.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've touched in several of our questions and answers. This is a complicated system. You know, we are not born hardwired to understand the U.S. Constitution and its nuances. Nobody expects all of us to understand all of that. But you need to have some fundamental grasp of what the structure of the government is and what the responsibilities of the branches are. And if you don't have that, then you're preaching to an electorate that is so easily subject to political pandering and misunderstanding that you get what we got. The problem is that doing something about this, in my opinion, and I've been working on it since I left the House actually, is that it's a generational issue. You know, it takes very patient capital to reverse our civic illiteracy and restore an electorate that understands enough about our politics to cast intelligent votes that, for instance, endorse the idea of compromise. That's why we have public schools. If you go back to the origins of the public education system, the founders understood we needed an electorate, a citizenry, that knew something about all of this or they were going to get it wrong. And so I don't want to point the blame away from Washington, but I think the blame for our current state of affairs is widely shared in the country by a citizenry that suffers from having been undereducated or misled about the nature of our government.
Let me just add to that, Homer. One, if I were a presidential candidate, and I'd like to see all the presidential candidates do this, a core part of what I would propose is mandatory national service. 1 year or 2 years, whether it's military or working in an impoverished community. And I would couple that with an introduction to it that includes a fundamental understanding of the system of government, but it's all about understanding that you're a part of a larger society and interacting with people who come from very different places than you do. We had, I think, a fundamental of that when, with the World War II generation and with people serving in the military, where one, you learn that merit mattered, and two, you learned that people who you thought were awful, because that's how you grew up, maybe weren't quite that way. It didn't erase prejudice or racism, but it made a real difference. And I think if there's an antidote to tribalism, it will be that. And if you couple that with, you'll get a little bit of pay, but then you can have student loan forgiven and other things, you could solve a lot of problems at once. So I'd start with that. And the other thing that I would do is I would make debate mandatory in public schools. Debate and speech. You know, the Parkland kids that have had a huge impact, they took speech and debate. It's mandatory in Broward County. These kids, many of them, the ones who've been the most outspoken, just happen to be taking a class where the focal point was guns. So they knew the issues. They had to argue all sides. They were not intimidated in front of anybody, and they could frame them in a way that would change the larger public debate. And it makes a real difference, and it's not that difficult to do.
David and I both served in the military, and at the risk of being off topic a little bit, let me just say hear to your suggestion. And
were you in the World War II generation, Homer?
And as many of you know, to keep moving, Sandra Day O'Connor's passion for civics education has generated her iCivics initiative, enormously important. And interestingly, Tom Friedman wrote a column not long ago saying that the two codes that your kids need for success are computer skills and understanding the Constitution. Let me ask one final question, which is there a gender component to tribalism and polarization? Might more women in Congress ameliorate the crisis, at least somewhat?
Well, I think we're going to find out. 100 women just got elected to Congress. What do you think, Norm?
So, you know, we've had all kinds of things written about this, and the women in the Senate have talked a lot about how they have regular weekly lunch and they can all work together. But then I look at the range of women who are in the Congress and who are prominent commentators, and they're not that different from the men. Now, I think there is a gender difference. Women like to talk things through more than men do. Women, as a general matter, I think are more empathetic. Men, if somebody comes up with a story of woe, look at how you can solve it instead of saying, oh, I'm so sorry. And that leads to all kinds of conflicts. I mean, we know a lot of this stuff. Deborah Tannen is one of my dear friends, and so I read all of her books on these things too. But, I think we should have a Congress that represents the country. I think the fact that we're now getting it more representative is a wonderful thing. But it's not going to solve our problems if we simply say, let's have 150 or 200 more women. If they're comparable to a lot of the people who are serving now and they come up through the same ranks that they have, maybe it'll be a little bit better. There will be more of an understanding of some of the family issues that are critical issues, including, I suspect, things like early childhood education. But I don't see that as a panacea. I wish it were.
Yeah, I was hanging my hat on this until I read something recently about a study that showed what you were just saying, Norm, that gender doesn't necessarily translate into a different operational style once elected to office. I'd still like to think that more women would be better than fewer, and my wife agrees.
You know, if it were that way, there are enough women in the Senate to change the entire balance of power. They could bring up things that the leadership won't bring up. They could act together to make sure that corrupt individuals are not confirmed to cabinet posts or other high positions or people who are unqualified get placed in those positions, they could change the debate and the dialogue. But they don't do that. They vote just the way the men do in terms of their own tribal party identities, with very, very, very rare exceptions.
Ray, the last word on this, or
I think things would have been a lot different if the woman would have been elected president. Think of what kind of administration. Think about the issues we'd be talking about today.
Amen.
It would have made a difference. The answer is it would have made a difference. That's the answer. Now, so
We'd be on the 175th Benghazi investigation and probably through the third impeachment trial, but yes.
the three of you are terrific. Thank you. Please join me in thanking this panel.